Well, my day started by putting my Sunbeam to work. Got a Ferrari, a dead one, a 365 GTC4, and it came to my shop as a non-runner. So just the problem with pulling a dead car into the shop is that it's just a matter of juggling. I'm really lucky I have the space to do it today, because usually this shop is filled with cars, but I managed to have some space to work with. But a lot of times when you pull a dead car into the shop, it's got to go somewhere where it's not going to block the door, and then you can't get anything out. If I use my truck, which I have outside, I could have taken my truck and dragged this car in here, but the problem then is, how do I get enough room to maneuver the truck out of here once this dead car is in here? I don't have enough room to even as much room as I have, I don't have enough room to maneuver a truck out easily. So you always try to do the easiest thing first. I could have taken my forklift, charged that battery. I'm sure the battery's dead. I could have dragged that in, but decided, hey, why don't I use what's available, which is my Sunbeam. My Sunbeam was here, was in the right position. It's small. I could maneuver it all over the place once I dragged the car in. So that was the first struggle of the day. So the next struggle of the day is to figure out why this car is a non-runner. I'd known this car for a long time, and it was I worked on it, the last time I worked on this C4 was at Francois' shop, which was several years ago. I'd have to look up when I actually worked on this car at Francois, but the owner had contacted us and said that the car had been sitting for a long time and had not been run, and we went ahead and recommissioned it, got it back up to running and driving condition. He came back with his son and picked it up, and the son now owns the car. He said that the car wasn't running, and he tried to get it going, and it failed to start, and tried a couple times, and yeah, so here it is. So he called me and says, hey, can you help me get the car started? I can't seem to do it. So first thing I did was just kind of jump in it. I'll show you what I did. He said it wouldn't start, but I always have to confirm. So I've jumped in here and turned on the ignition. I can hear the fuel pump running. Clock works. But when I go to crank it, I made sure that the fuel pump was running for a while if there was any fuel in there. And I go to crank it, and it just doesn't feel like it has any spark. Like there's no ignition whatsoever. So here we go. Got to figure out what's going on with the why there isn't any spark, or at least confirm what I suspect, which is that there's no spark. The other problem with the C4 is to check to make sure that there's fuel, because obviously there's three things to combustion, as they always say. There's spark, there's fuel, and there's compression. Well, compression usually is pretty easy to understand. It's like you should be able to a car doesn't just lose compression all of a sudden unless it's blown a cylinder or it's gotten so old that the rings just aren't compressing any. So chances are, if this car ran and last time it was run and parked, it had compression. So a lot of times you can eliminate compression unless it's a car that has absolutely an unknown quantity. So the next step is to check fuel, and then to check spark. Well, the fuel, I hear the fuel pump running, which is a good sign, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's running. It might just mean that the fuel pump is running but not pumping fuel. C4, unfortunately, these are 6 DCOE carburetors. So in order to take a peek down in the throats to see if it's squirting, is you have to take these covers off. Sometimes getting in there, you might have to get a mirror, because it really you won't be able to look straight down the carburetor throats that easily. I'm going to see if I could snatch off one of these covers and take a peek. So the fuel covers, or the fuel air filter boxes, come off kind of okay. Getting them back on is a whole other issue. But here's a peek down at the carburetors, and what I think I'm seeing is no fuel. You should be able to see a squirt of fuel in there, but I don't see any fuel. So that could be a problem. Let's investigate a little further. So the first thing I did was I checked to make sure that there was fuel arriving at the carburetors, which I confirmed. So then I removed the fuel rail to take a peek down in the carburetors, because if there wasn't any squirting, then I suspect that something's going on with the needles and the floats, because there's no fuel getting inside the carburetors. If the fuel was getting to the rail, which something was clogging up the carburetors. Instead of taking all the carburetors apart, what I'm trying to do is just take a peek. I'm trying to take a peek here. I just found a loose nut over here. I'm trying to take a peek inside the carburetor to see if there's any fuel in the bowls. So I can take the top of this carburetor off and take a peek inside without taking the whole carburetor out. I'm just going to take a quick peek inside here. Yep, dry as a bone. So let me show you what I found. So first off, there's no fuel inside the bowl, completely empty. There's some blue stuff down there. I don't know what that is. I think that's just the evaporated fuel that's in there. I'm gonna have to clean that out with some carb cleaner. But the other thing that I found is the float itself. The needle, if you look at that needle down there, it's not moving, so it's actually stuck. Let me go free it up with some carb cleaner and it should drop down. So if you look at after taking it apart and cleaning it, that float needle rises up and down. See if you can actually see it. Can you see that? So when the fuel rises, it raises the float and it closes the needle, but when it drops, it needs to also keep flow in. So that kind of has to ride freely in there. So I think all of them are stuck, so I got to take it all apart and clean them all out. So years ago when we worked on this car, all the carburetors came out, they all got cleaned. They look in really clean shape on the outside. It's a shame because they just, when you look inside, I'm hoping I don't have to take all these carburetors apart and redo them again, because all the little spaces and crevices inside the carburetor can get filled with this residue, and if they're clogged, there might not be anything we can do except to take the carburetors apart. What I'm trying to do right now is just get this car started to make sure that it's just carburetor, or if I have an ignition issue, I can deal with that. But just looking at the signs, I think I might be able to get this car started with just cleaning out the floats. Yep, empty and stuck. Same thing. So I think all the carburetors have the same issue. Check valve looks okay. Let's spray some of this in there. Get my little tube. Take some of that blue stuff out of there. What I'm hoping is once I get the general residue out, so I can get the floats working and run some fresh fuel in here, the fresh fuel will dissolve that blue stuff out, and then we can get to work. But have to make this thing work again. So let me go take that one apart. Okay, got that one freed up. Drop this one back in. Now that I did these carburetors, so what I'm going to do now is just put the fuel rail back on and get this kind of in place. I'm reusing the red washers for right now, just to get this back together. If I have to take it apart, I can just replace them. This car obviously needs a full service anyway, but I just want to first get it to the point where it'll actually run. Get everything kind of centered, where everything's kind of happy. There's that one. All right, that's that. Now on to the next side. First thing I have to do is loosen the fuel rail. As you can see, it's a little wet, and that means that there is fuel getting to the fuel rail. See, there's still fuel dripping out of there. It smells pretty bad. It's smell of old fuel. So one of the things we're gonna have to do is get some fresh fuel in this thing. Let's make sure that none of these red washers are gonna fall off and fall into the nether regions of the car. All right, let's take a peek. Dry as a bone. And, yep, stuck float. So let's clean this one out too. See, I can feel that's still working. Oh, I get my tube. I don't have the right tube for this. I think I've lost it. So I'm gonna have to just keep using this one that's kind of loose. But yeah, there's just blue stuff in here. So I'm gonna soak that up, dissolve it a little bit, pull some of it out, and clean that out a little bit. So the other thing that is kind of different on GTC 4s because of these Weber DCOEs. DCOEs for Webers is they're otherwise known as side drafts. So they sit sideways, and the throats of the carburetors, instead of sitting in the middle of the V that go down, they they're made to run sideways. So they're called side draft carburetors. I think that this is specific to GTCs because they run DCOEs. They can have a problem because when that needle, as much as the needle getting stuck closed, which is what we're having, they can also get stuck open, just like the trash gets in there and the needle won't close and won't shut the fuel off. So what ends up happening with DCOE is because the way the carburetor and the trumpets face downwards towards the carburetor or towards the throat of the intake, if a needle gets stuck on a downdraft carburetor, it just kind of overflows the top of the float, as you saw, comes up and it just overflows the bowl and it will drip down. Now on a downdraft carburetor, when it overfills the bowl, some of it will drip down the throat, but a lot of it will just overflow the top of the float and just drip to the outside of the carburetor. With a DCOE, when it overflows, it flows down the throat. All of it goes down the throat of the carburetor. Well, the problem with that on this car particularly is that as it flows in, if the valve is open, let's say the intake valve is open, or even for that matter, well, the intake valve has to be open, the fuel will overflow the bowl. It'll drip down into the intake. It'll drip down into here. If the valve is open, just so happens that when you stop the engine and let's say this valve was open, fuel will just drip and fill that cylinder up with fuel. And if you don't know that, or if you don't know that your float is stuck, when you go to fire up the engine and you immediately crank, let's say this cylinder fires, if the opposite cylinder is on a compression stroke, or not the opposite, but if one of the cylinders is on a compression stroke and fires, it will bring this piston up and hit the cylinder that's filled with fuel and hydrolock the motor. And hydrolocking is something that's really bad, because what's going to end up happening is you're going to bend a rod, or you're going to break something internally, or even crack a piston. You can also crack a cylinder liner, because what happens is the fuel is not compressible. So on a car that has been started in a while, if you're running it, you don't let the fuel pumps run forever, because you can fill a cylinder. And you also have to be careful. So when you're cranking an engine over, especially if it's been running and you're not sure, I slowly bump the starter a little at a time. And if one cylinder is actually filled with fuel, you'll feel it. You'll crank it and it'll just stop. Eventually that fuel will leak past the rings and everything if it sits, but if it's freshly filled and you have an actual ignition point of another cylinder, it can bend a rod. And I've actually seen that happen on one of these C4s. Not something to lose sleep over, but something to know. Don't just go and run a fuel pump, leave it on for forever, and then just go and crank it. I mean, you want to make sure that your carburetor is in good tune. They're not stuck, they're not leaking. It's just one of those quirks about a C4. I got everything hooked back up. I'm going to try to see if it'll catch. Let's see if it'll fire up, because checked all the carburetors. I think they're all squirting and the fuel rail is filled. And let's see what happens. Look at that. We're fired. That's great. All right, let me check everything else, but let me open the door so I don't kill myself, but that was it. So all the carburetors. Before I run it anymore, let me just make sure we got oil in here. Oil looks good. All right, so I open the door so I don't asphyxiate myself. Very slowly, but that's okay. It's ice cold, no choke. Warm up a little bit. It's gonna pop and spit like that for a little bit. It's got some shitty ass gas in it, so at least it got started and running. and running.